All right, welcome to CHI's Masters of Suspicion, focused on the American Gothic. This is week 7, The Perils of Permissiveness, where we'll look at Charlotte Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper. First, a little review. Last week, we discussed the plight of Bartleby and the way that Melville uses the Gothic to bathe the seemingly innocuous and banal world of the office in terms of its power, its dehumanizing influences, and its push toward death. We discussed the implications of this kind of power as it destroys communities, allowing us to treat each other as lifeless objects in the world instead of selves worthy of respect. Because it is a Gothic story, Melville offers very little by way of resolution or things that we can do. There's very little hope at the end of the story. But there is a sense that in spite of an apparent lack of options or opportunities, something needs to be done. And that's what the reader is left with by the end of the story. This week, we turn, as I said, to The Yellow Wallpaper, which is a semi-autobiographical story that horrified its initial readers on its first publication, or even when she was trying to get it published. There was a lot of rejections just because they were terrified by the implications of what the story was. The story offers us a chance to return to the house or the home as a centerpiece of the American Gothic and examine how the Gothic offers authors a unique opportunity to examine the logics of power and control at their most subtle. In this case, Gilman portrays problems of power that emerge through the presence of honest love and affection. Although John, the husband in the story, becomes its villain due to Gilman's feminist critique of masculine power, in this case, it looks at John's status as a man, a physician, and a husband, which gets Gilman to strike at 3 different targets of power at once. So he's villainized. But the story works because Gilman shows the consequences of it is less because of John's power or John's antagonism or John's antipathy toward her. He actually cares about her. That's what makes the story work. And what it allows readers to do is look at the perils of permissiveness and the way that women's idealized feminine behaviors, the submissive wife, the submissive patient, or the submissive woman, are harmed even by those with the most loving intentions. The tragedy and horror of the story emerges, therefore, in the fault line of love's ill-intentioned cruelties, in the way that power and enlightenment logics of control, even within the space of a loving home, can lead to the dehumanization of those that they're intended to help. So that's where we're going to be exploring. We okay with that? All right. So start out with the first point. And my approach through the story is really going to focus a lot on Gilman's logic. And the first thing that I found interesting in the story is what Gilman does with the pronoun one. So haunting the one. Gilman begins her story by describing the pointedly unnamed narrator's take on the summer house, which serves as the setting of the story. She writes, quote, "It is very seldom that mere ordinary people like John and myself secure ancestral halls for the summer. A colonial mansion, a hereditary estate, I would say a haunted house and reach the height of romantic felicity, but that would be asking too much of fate. Still, I will proudly declare that there is something queer about it. Else why should it be let so cheaply, and why have stood so long untenanted? John laughs at me, of course, but one expects that in marriage." Already, the narrator has invoked a ghost of the Gothic, initially resisting its allure by dismissing it as a felicity, but she shows its desirability, as well as a troubling reluctance to ask much. She'll accept, not ask, not request. But something more insidious is raised in the opening lines, as Gilman instantly pushes readers to inhabit the narrator's perspective. The narrator's identity is instantly elided. There's no I, but only an objectified myself. I mean, there's that grammatical slippage, which sounds wrong as you read it, and it's because the I isn't there. It's a myself that's the object that already takes John's view of her rather than her own view of herself. And it starts instantly in that way. There is an I that appears in the next sentence, but only with the conditional would say. She doesn't say anything, she only would say. That's what the I is able to do, is conditionally act, but not actually act. The third sentence gives the reader a still I, something that's simultaneously defiant, but quiet, stilled. Less subtle, though, is the final sentence, the fact that one expects being laughed at in a marriage. It's relatively certain that 19th century readers would not believe that John shares this expectation, right? The one is supposed to be a universal pronoun. Anyone can be a one, right? That's how one works. One does this, one does that, one expects this, one expects that. What happens in that sentence, though, is that the focus of the sentence becomes the one who expects something, a one that the narrator inhabits, even though it sounds odd for modern readers to hear the one feminized in this way. It's a feminized one, it's a gendered one, and it's a one that stands against what a male assumption would be. Does that make sense? The one who expects that in a marriage isn't the man, ever. Mm-hmm. Only the woman would be a one who would expect that. It's a universal one, and it allows the reader to inhabit the space of that one, but that one is haunted by the dissonance between the expectation of its universality, which is the goal of one, right? Is to become universal. And the fact that it's being feminized shows the hidden masculine backdrop that usually accompanies the one. Not only masculine, but white and privileged. That's what one means. One is not a woman, one is a man. Does that make sense? Okay. So the effect of that opening, I mean, if you really spend time with it, or if you really pour over it, or if you allow yourself to pause when that troubles you. I mean, how many of you are troubled when you read that? Just briefly. If you pause at that, some of that starts to float up a little bit. And again, it's not absolutely present, it's haunted. The one is something that becomes haunted right away in the story. The strategy continues throughout the opening of the short story. 3 sentences later, the narrator writes, quote, "You see how he does not believe I am sick. And what can one do?" End quote. Although Gilman allows an I here, she makes sure it remains concealed. The reader gains no knowledge of the narrator's opinion regarding her own illness. Because the you summons the reader, the question, what can one do, provides a one that includes both the narrator and the reader in wondering about the question. The one is abstracted from any personal position, though, right? Because it's universal. It discards its particularities in becoming a one. But even though it's discarded and it's universalized and abstracted that way, the person is exactly what's at stake with instantiation of the one. We okay? The third instance of one occurs here. Quote, "If a physician of high standing and one's own husband assures friends and relatives that there's really nothing the matter with one but temporary nervous depression, a slight hysterical tendency, what is one to do?" Question, end quote. The one here is still, given the time period, definitely female, right? I mean, there are no homosexual marriages. If it's one's own husband, it's going to be the wife speaking. So we still have the feminized one, but it's a super personalized, particularized one, right? It's one who has a husband who happens to be a physician of high standing who's doing these sorts of things. There's nothing general or universal about the one. Gilman's insistence on putting a one here really pushes at what the capacity of that one can do. How universal can a one be when one is that heavily entrenched in all of these other cultural factors? Depersonalizing the self as one in an incredibly personalized setting thus shows the uncanny relationship between the self and abstracted pronouns. The question, what is one to do, at the end of all of these, uses the abstracted neutral space to invite readers to reflect on the very specific initial one that first appeared. The final one in the story's opening occurs in a question that alters the boundaries of the one to again incorporate the reader. Divided from the one about whom nothing is the matter by a dash instead of a period, the one in what is one to do, like the one that initially sublates the reader and the narrator, the you and the I, that occurred in the third instance of the I, or of the one, I'm sorry, is granted a temporary freedom to act and wonder. Right? There's a little suspension in the question, a little space that's given where the reader and the one can just say, what can one do? Is there anything? And it opens up a space of a question, but there's no content provided. And the answer is suggested but not given. Nothing. What can one do? Nothing. What is one's capacity? Not to act. What can I do? Nothing. And it's haunting. So with tonalities of helplessness and despair, the nature of the question indicates that the one asking it has no given or ready answer. It avoids answering that nothing, even though nothing is kind of the anticipated next step. It shies short of that, but the despair in realizing that there's nothing that can be done haunts the question itself. In turn, the effect of the question allows the reader to experience the dejection and paralysis that occurs when one becomes a one. I'm a white guy. I'm not in the state of the narrator exactly, but in reading the story, I'm able to understand the powerlessness that comes with the situation of that one in particular. It's open to me. What would I do if I were such a one? And suddenly, in inhabiting that space, I realize something absolutely hopeless. It invites me to do so in that abstracted, universal way that we're really, really comfortable and familiar with. So this is the work of the two statements that offer the beginnings of a personal conviction. So this is a little later on. The narrator writes, quote, "Personally, I disagree with their ideas. Personally, I believe that congenial work with excitement and change would do me good. But what is one to do?" End quote. Gilman engulfs the autonomy enabled by refusal, along with the narrator's inability to credit her own belief, unlike the unflappable view of John, in the pathetic, disempowered space of the one, the space in which the narrator has opted to dwell, and the space into which the reader has been invited. It's an absolutely hopeless space. And it occurs really, really quickly in the story. Does that make sense? So Gilman's use of one overall, I think, does it for a few things. First, it illuminates the hidden gender undergirding the space of one that everybody assumes to be neutral. I mean, how many of you use one when you intend something that's neutral, available to everybody, right? Anyone can be a one, right? But it really shows a lot of those assumptions that nonetheless frame what kind of one is speaking of when one discusses who one is or what one might do. Secondly, disclosing this hidden gender shows a way that women are erased culturally in favor of men, even at the level of language. As we speak of one, we keep reintroducing that kind of distinction that just softly erases the place of women in our society. It's what we assume about one, and what we don't assume about how some ones are not the same as other ones. Secondly, her one is a space that allows for the incorporation of the reader into its weird space. Even male readers are feminized by this one. That's what happens when I read the story. I become the one who's disempowered the way that women are disempowered. Overall, the one permits Gilman to show the uncanny way that women are forced to haunt the theoretically neutral, theoretically genderless spaces. And it's worth considering how many others occupy and haunt this theoretical one. The homeless, racial minorities, those with disabilities. One does not necessarily speak for all in those cases. Our general use of one obscures differences in ways that provide us with comfort, as in, one can get a job if one tries, right? I mean, how many of you have heard that rhetoric floating around there, right? Anyone can get a job. And there's that sense of one that has certain kind of assumptions buried in it that we don't want to think about, because that would require us taking responsibility of the world that we live in. Using one deflects that responsibility and protects us from acts of compassion toward those who aren't those kinds of ones. Today, the term all also functions in a similar manner, especially in the all lives matter rejoinder to Black Lives Matter. Does that make sense? How one and all function in that way? Power comes in defining what one means. Power erases difference in the form of all, but very subtly. Any questions about that? All right. Point 2, the critique of unquestioning judgment. John, the narrator's husband, is a physician in fine standing who desires to give his wife the best possible care. You might not like John, but he seems to really be doing his best, right? Like, he honestly seems to care about his wife. He honestly wants her to be healthy. And that's what makes the story horrifying. You have to believe that John loves his wife. And you get that, right? Not so much?
No, in fact, interesting, up until almost the end, I still had deducted that his long hours in the city and at the office was another female.
Oh.
And I did not see him as really loving his wife. I saw him as really wanting her out of the way so his life could go on.
I can see that.
And it was way till almost the end that I started thinking, well, now wait a minute here. Does he really love her? But I mean, for most of the story, I felt he did not.
There's a lack of intimacy in the marriage, clearly. But I guess my interpretation of what I would argue is that the lack of intimacy comes with the rigidified and stratified gender relationships. You know, he's the one. This is the way that men are supposed to be. This is the way that wives are supposed to be, and that's just how it's going to go. You know, I don't see strong suggestions of infidelity. You know, like it doesn't. You know, that would be something that you could bring into the text, but on its own, the text doesn't seem to really have any indication that that's what he's interested in. I mean, he's gone a lot, and he trusts that she just needs to sit there, and that's the best thing for her. And he really, really seems to believe that. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So John is described as practical in the extreme, having no patience with faith. Right? So when it comes to matters of faith, John's absolutely opposed to that in favor of reason. Right? Nonetheless, the narrator states that John does not believe that the narrator is sick, which gets right back into the faith that he has no patience for. The descriptions do much to illuminate a problem with science that's become prominent in contemporary debates. Stopping short of debunking science as untrue, the way that a fundamentalist or a creationist might try, Gilman simply points out how the scientific worldview, in spite of its claims to certainty that some, usually non-scientists, will make about science, that science is a belief about the world. It's a belief about a way of interpreting the world or certain parts of the world that neglect other parts. The reader learns, in fact, that John's presumption to a scientific, objective, detached view of reality has Gothic undertones. John has, quote, an intense horror of superstition. Right? I mean, it's not something he's dispassionate about. He has an intense horror of it. Very, very Gothic. The term superstition remains helpfully undefined, and it goes back to his faith, or the whole mechanics of science being its own kind of superstition, with its own rituals, its own charms, its own formulas. He has a horror of what he calls superstition, but that doesn't mean that what he abides by or adheres to is much different or much better. The narrator also relates how John, quote, scoffs openly at any talk of things not to be felt and seen and put down in figures, end quote. John, a physician, seems a fan of material reductionism. But Gilman's careful to show how this, too, falls apart. It can't be sustained. So the first question of language, felt, is not quite as certain as John might wish it to be, right? When the narrator says that she feels something strange about the house, which is a different kind of felt, John responds, she felt a draft. The question of feeling is one that's simultaneously tactile and intuitive. John's embrace of feeling, like something he can feel, which means tactility, right? I need to feel it to know that it's there. Let me touch it. Feelings are bigger than that. You can't just reduce it to one portion and neglect the others. And that's part of, I think, what Gilman wants to show. John desires to eliminate the latter and preserve only the former, but he can't quite get the language that allows it. John also feels much easier. Again, feeling, in more of her way of feeling something strange, right? John feels much easier about the narrator after noticing improvements in her flesh color and exercise. Ironically, the narrator directly refutes John's feelings using objective evidence, arguing that her weight is no more than it had been and she only eats well when John is present. John chooses to adhere to what he feels, however, instead of what he can measure, and he speaks to her as though she were an infant who were not present. Quote, "Bless her little heart," said he with a big hug. "She shall be as sick as she pleases. But now let's improve the shining hours by going to sleep and talk about it in the morning." End quote. This response to the narrator shows the power of emotional feelings even in those who generally deride them. Gilman implies here that deceiving oneself about not having inconsistencies, as one tends to do, is more dangerous than simply being inconsistent. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
The things to be seen is equally problematic. The strategy here is to reveal how seeing is something just as troubling, and it's troubling especially for those like John who desire certainty. It's troublingly subjective the way that feeling is. To see something is no proof of its reality. Gilman allows the narrator to see many things that readers may doubt might be seen by another through her power of imaginative projection. This power has been developed by the narrator since her youth. As she describes the creeping woman, she writes, quote, "I see her on that long lane under the trees, creeping along," and later notices, quote, "her sometimes away off in the open country, creeping as fast as a cloud shadow in a high wind," end quote. The reader is reminded of the narrator's description of her windows early in her stay. So this is before she starts going crazy. Quote, "There's a beautiful shaded lane that runs down there from my house. I always fancy I see people walking in these numerous cots and arbors, but John has cautioned me not to give way to fancy in the least. He says that with my imaginative power and habit of story making, a nervous weakness like mine is sure to lead to all manner of excited fancies, and that I ought to use my will and good sense to check the tendency. So I try." Is John right in this? Absolutely, right? I mean, John is absolutely correct that her imaginative powers get her into trouble. She can't handle them. He is absolutely correct in his medical assessment of the narrator on that point. Right? I mean, can you see that? Would you agree with that? The narrator's tendency to see is something that John wishes to check. And rightly so. Another side note here, this is the only use of the term power in the entire story. It's used once in a story about hidden forms of control. I mean, the story is all about power, but the only power referenced is the narrator's imagination. That's the only form of power that he will acknowledge. Otherwise, the marriage isn't about power for him. Medicine isn't about power. Her imagination is about power. He fears it, wants to quiet it. But again, not because he's vicious. It's because it's actually what's probably best for the narrator. Does that make sense? John wishes to remind the narrator of her tendency to emphasize her fancy at the expense of reality, distorting what she sees. And this likely refers to the childhood habit that the narrator later references. The narrator describes the wallpaper writing, quote, "I never saw so much expression in an inanimate thing before, and we all know how much expression they have. I used to lie awake as a child and get more entertainment and terror out of blank walls and plain furniture than most children could find in a toy store. I remember what a kindly wink the knobs of our big old bureau used to have, and there was one chair that always seemed like a strong friend," end quote. Gilman has her narrator normalize her behavior of projection onto inanimate things in an assumption that the trait is universal. She's appealing to the logic of the one, even though she isn't demonstrating the one here. The one had a different use, I think. Here it's showing the problem of universalization, the way that we try to normalize our own encounters with the world and assume that everybody else acts in the same way. Again, Gilman's narrator is not innocent in Gilman's eyes, right? She's not a heroine or a protagonist or somebody to be idealized or modeled in any way. She's as criticized by Gilman as John is. Does that make sense? Ultimately, her memory reveals that the narrator's fantasies infect her reality. The chair that seemed like a strong friend would serve as a refuge, quote, "if any of the other things looked too fierce," end quote. This behavior blossoms to projecting a population around her lonely world, and finally, perhaps, a companion within her room with whom she can empathize. Succumbing to her fancies is problematic because instead of simply stopping her story when it becomes scary, the narrator continues to invest in her personal narrative until it provides a spot of comfort, leaving all pretense of a shared objective world behind. The narrator, in other words, is a less than reliable guide. Does that make sense? John, however, doesn't help the situation. In response to her husband claiming that she has gotten better, the narrator replies, "better in body, perhaps," but is cut off by a look from her husband, so stern and reproachful that the narrator, quote, "could not say another word," end quote. Gilman has John respond in a fashion that undermines any validity of his critique of the narrator's fancy. right? So on the one hand, he's right in critiquing her. On the other hand, he does so for all of the worst reasons. So here's John's response, quote, "My darling," said he. And again, I think he really is affectionate to the extent that he can be. Like, I think he really tries. I want to believe he means that, darling. "My darling," said he, "I beg of you, for my sake and for our child's sake, as well as for your own." Again, she comes last, right? He comes first. Child comes second, she comes last. I mean, that's the priority system in the 19th century. Certainly totally unlike today's. "For my sake and for our child's sake, as well as for your own, that you will never for one instant let that idea enter your mind. There is nothing so dangerous, so fascinating to a temperament like yours. It is a false and foolish fancy. Can you not trust me as physician when I tell you so?" End quote. There's no appeal to love, it's all appeal to science, right? Trust me as a physician. The idea that John fears is the possibility of a mental illness. Gilman only provides John with recourse to fallacious arguments against her fancy, however, using both the pathetic fallacy about feelings and recourse to authority, which are objective standards. But they're bad arguments. The reader, in other words, is distanced from both the narrator's over-reliance on fancy and from John's hostility toward that which dwells beyond quantification. The inability to treat mental illness seriously as a potential problem pushes it into the shadows, but it doesn't allow it to vanish. John can't see it, so he wants to believe it isn't there. It doesn't work that way. The final descriptor of John is that he scoffs at the, quote, "things not to be seen," or things not to be put down in figures, right? So we've looked at seeing. The third thing is that he scoffs at things not to be put down in figures. As she did with feel and see, Gilman uses the term figure throughout the story to indicate how such terms are still haunted by their uncanny other. In this case, the term figure, after this initial description of John, only appears twice in the story and describes the apparition behind the wallpaper, something that's put down in figure. The figure emerges as a, quote, "strange, provoking, formless sort of figure that seems to skulk about behind that silly and conspicuous front design," end quote, but grows in power and becomes more distinct until the narrator states that the, quote, "faint figure behind seemed to shake the pattern just as if she wanted to get out," end quote. As Gilman's narrator studies the figure, it becomes more and more clear what that figure is and what it looks like. Overall, Gilman's language undermines John's faith in science at a linguistic level. No argument is made, nothing is disproven. Gilman's not saying science is bad or that it doesn't work or that you shouldn't trust doctors or anything like that. Instead, Gilman works to show how science is its own form of flawed interpretation that remains blind to its own shortcomings. It's not better and it's not worse than the narrator's imaginative ramblings, which fail to accommodate reality in a shared and meaningful way. Ultimately, I would argue, Gilman is interested in criticizing the certainty with which each engages the world, combined with an inability to question or even listen to other perspectives that the spouses here would make available. If either of them were more able to listen to questions, both of them, one suspects, might be aided and the marriage would undoubtedly improve. Does that make sense? All right. Point 3. Uncovering the pattern. The Gothic dimension of the story arises with the narrator's interaction with the wallpaper. That's pretty clear, I think. Her relationship begins as one of hatred. She writes, quote, "I never saw a worse paper in my life," and describes it as, quote, "one of those sprawling, flamboyant patterns committing every artistic sin." She continues, writing, quote, "It is dull enough to confuse the eye in following, pronounced enough to constantly irritate and provoke study, and when you follow the lame, uncertain curves for a little distance, they suddenly commit suicide, plunge off at outrageous angles, destroy themselves in unheard of contradictions," end quote. What's important to note is the way that the object in the story reflects the story itself. The story that we're reading, the Yellow Wallpaper, is also confusing. It also irritates. It also provokes story. It's also dull. And it also plunges into contradictory destruction. As we read about the figure of the narrator in the Yellow Wallpaper, staring at the Yellow Wallpaper to uncover a figure, we're encouraged to find ourselves in the narrator's place. Does that make sense? It places readers, or traps readers in an interesting way. As a reader, I found the story both dull and irritating when I first read it. And after careful study, the figure started to come out and I started to understand the pattern. It became more and more fascinating. That fascination, of course, is something that Gilman writes against in her own mapping of the narrator's despair. But it's hard to escape from if one really, really, really invests in it. The movement from hatred to identification, because that's part of the problem, right? She hates the wallpaper and then slowly starts to identify with it as part of the ongoing tenor of her environment, occurs at the level of language. And again, Gilman, I think, is really insistent on how words shape and modify our experience of reality. The narrator is not aware of this movement, which becomes revealed only in the text that she's writing. This scene occurs in the evening, and the narrator writes, quote, "The moon shines in all around just as the sun does. I hate to see it sometimes. It creeps so slowly and always comes in by one window or another. John was asleep, and I hated to waken him, so I kept still and watched the moonlight on that undulating wallpaper till I felt creepy." The term creep is used here for the second and third times. The first time indicates the space of the wallpaper, while the second indicates the presence of the moonlight in the temporal dimension that it marks out. The light of the moon, which creeps, is the necessary precondition for her seeing the pattern at night. In the next sentence, the narrator understands herself to have been infected by the latent creepiness that hangs about the room. She watches until she herself feels creepy, embodying as a feeling the space and time that she had disliked and hated. The term creep itself slowly begins to creep throughout the text, in the way that Bartleby's question, or the statement I would prefer not to, started to creep throughout the office. Here, the term creep itself is that which creeps. And it's creepy when it happens. The next step is equally subtle, as the narrator describes the figure behind the wallpaper in language that also describes herself. It's difficult to say whether she's projecting herself into the wallpaper or emulating what she believes that she sees. In either case, here's the passage, quote, "I didn't realize for a long time what the thing was that showed behind, that dim sub-pattern, but I am now quite sure it is a woman. By daylight she is subdued, quiet. I fancy it is the pattern that keeps her so still. It is so puzzling. It keeps me quiet by the hour." Both the figure and the narrator are subdued, quiet, still, and they're made so because of the pattern that they cannot penetrate or break through. The relationship between the women, the one outside of the wallpaper and the one within it, is never actually collapsed, right? There's never a point where Gilman says, "Oh, I am this one." The woman never says, "I am you," or something like that. There's always a space or a tension between what the narrator sees and what comes out. There's always a difference between the characters, but the two retain their parallels, which makes thinking of that in terms of a collapse interesting. The beginning of the final section maintains the space through an indirect grammatical mirroring. Quote, "As soon as it was moonlight and that poor thing began to crawl and shake the pattern, I got up and ran to help her." Right, so there's an initial point of difference. Quote, "I pulled and she shook, I shook and she pulled, and before morning we had peeled off yards of that paper." End quote. They mirror each other. The most intensive point of the identification comes after the figure has been released. Quote, "I wonder if they all came out of that wallpaper as I did." And there's a far stronger I, right? There's an active I at this point, but it's an I that's reclaimed by virtue of insanity, not an I that's actually self-possessed.
Is there an importance that she shifts to the plural there and said they all? Yeah.
I mean, again, like she's seen multitudes of women creeping about.
Well, I wondered if that was, kind of like the universal woman experience. Yeah.
I mean, that's a very easy argument, I think, to back up. I'll put it that way.
Mm-hmm.
This leads to the horrors at the end when the narrator locks John out of the room and forbids his re-entry. The grammar shifts from the present to the past tense. Quote, "Why, there's John at the door. It's no use, young man. You can't open it. How he does call and pound. Now he's crying for an axe. It'd be a shame to break down that beautiful door. John, dear," said I in the gentlest voice, "the key is down by the front steps under a plantain leaf." That silenced him for a few moments. And again, she has the power of speech. He's the one who's silenced. It's a reversal of what happens earlier. The narrator has assumed a semblance of control. The young man also offsets the little heart that John offered earlier in the story. The final paragraph, however, is the best. It's beautiful. Quote, "I've got out at last," said I, "in spite of you and Jane, and I pulled off most of the paper so you can't put me back." Now, why should that man have fainted? But he did, and right across my path by the wall, so that I had to creep over him every time. That's the end of the story. And many interesting things happen, I think, at the end of it. First, there's the ambiguity of what it means that she's gotten out. Beyond identifying with the figure she projected, she's also gotten out of a world of medicalization, reduction, and control. She's got out of it, right? She's not trapped in it anymore. She paid the price with her sanity, but it seems to have been successful, or at least for the moment, right? She's empowered by what she's done. After a defiant statement, the narrator then asks a medical question. Why should that man have fainted? Right? I mean, she has access to looking at her own weight, her own color, her own diet. She has access to those kinds of scientific questions. She's just not beholden to them or bound to them in the same kind of way that John is. It's interesting. It's a question that allows her ability, or it shows her ability, that her ability to ask it means that she's assumed a position of maximal power, and that her ability to ask such questions in no way means that she's sane. Right? You can ask medicalized questions or objective questions from a radically insane perspective. It doesn't mean that you're grounded in any way, shape, or form. Does that make sense? Finally, Gilman allows the creep to return one last time, as the narrator is literally able to walk all over her husband the way he'd figuratively walked all over her during their marriage. Creeps all over him.
Every time.
Every time. The process of identification is both liberating and horrifying. It shows the lengths to which human ingenuity can go to relieve the self from unpleasant situations. But as the ending shows, the ability to imagine ourselves out of reality is not a trick that only dreamers play. John imagines himself out of reality just as clearly throughout the story, in spite of his insistence on what he can feel, see, and put down to figures. Right? The reality he lives in, where he's a good doctor whose wife is getting better, is clearly divorced from the actual situation, right? He's just as crazy relative to an objectively determinable reality as the narrator is. They're both predicating reality on their own assumptions about the world, rather than looking at the world itself to reveal what's going on. Does that make sense? What Gilman seems to get at is the need for perspective, for questions, for skepticism, and for scrutiny. It's a way to always realize that the truth remains beyond our grasp. Any questions?
When was this story written?
1897, I think. I think it was 1897. I could be off by a year or two. Psychoanalysis was just starting to leave. I mean, there was an awareness of mental illness that was becoming more and more plausible as something that medicine could deal with, but it was still fairly on the fringes.
May I ask you a question?
Yeah.
I didn't read the story. I was fascinated with what you were saying. But it brought to mind, for some reason, a book called The House of the Spirits
I haven't
by
read it.
Isabel Allende. Okay.
Oh, I know it, yeah, I know that they, I haven't read that.
Where she punishes her husband by not communicating with him. But she is also in touch with spirits.
Okay.
And it has a political background. This is a much more modern book. But the way she exerts her power is by denying communication.
In this case, again, I don't know that it's so much a lack of communication.
I'm not saying she did.
Yeah. It's because she's willing to communicate until her husband won't listen to her, right? And then she just writes, even though she's not supposed to, just to have some form of expression. But the problem isn't a lack of communication. It's the perils of permissiveness, right? It's the wife's obediently accepting what one should expect in a marriage, what one ought to do as a patient, what women ought to do. I mean, it's all of that. She willingly divests herself of all agency, all autonomy, as much as she can, and she means to do it. Because that's what she's supposed to do. That's the pattern for women in the 19th century. I mean, of course, we're totally modernized now. Everything is wholly different. But at least then, women, that's where they were, right? And permitting that, allowing that, is what the problem is. It's a refusal to take autonomy. It's a refusal to respect one's own dignity or one's worth as a one who isn't just one anonymously. The problem is that her strategy of accommodating her husband is far too successful. That's the problem. Implications. Number one, obviously Gilman writes about the use of power and dynamics of control within the household. The story shows that the well-intentioned love and care of John goes very, very poorly for his wife. Love, in other words, ain't enough. And when it appears to be enough, that's usually only complicating the problem by burying the truth. Anything that looks like it's working really, really well is probably only not sufficiently observed. Number two, mental illness is something that's real. And again, the story was written before psychoanalysis was popularized in America. But mental illness is also still not taken seriously as seriously as physical illness, even today across the world. There's more and more acceptance. What's that?
It carries a lot more stigma, though.
Far more stigma. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot more stigma about mental illness, but it's not or because it carries that stigma, I guess, people don't believe it's as real as a physical illness. Insurance won't cover it as often. You know, like just little things like that show as a society, we don't place a value on its treatment, or we don't have a belief in its power the way that we would with somebody who has cancer or, you know, whatever other malady.
Well, one of the problems is that we still don't know enough about the mind and the brain in order to have more effective treatment. But when I was a kid, you didn't want to mention that anybody had any kind of depression or anything of that sort because your family would be ostracized. People would not want to go there. And I think that still happens today. And you know, we have some grandchildren that have some mental problems, and you should see the reaction of the parents. You know, it's a horror. And
it's a private horror.
Yes,
it's not a public one, right? It's something that's kept a secret, and it's a source of shame.
Right.
And it's not something that there's really a desire to become aware about. You know, it's something that we protect.
But nobody says, well, you know, it's like diabetes.
No.
Nobody says, or cancer.
No.
Nobody says that. It's
and a lot of why I think this goes back to John. Right? It goes back to a mindset that thinks that the only reality are things that can be seen and felt and put down in figures. And mental illness doesn't necessarily obey the logic of a reduction or a materialist reduction, right? There's something odd about it. And it goes back to Dickinson's poem that we read the first day of class.
It's also typical 19th century, right? Because nowadays science is not associated with things that you can necessarily see.
True, but and again, I think there's a difference between how scientists approach science and how the common public views science. And scientism is dangerous a threat as any kind of fundamentalist dogma. You know, and that's I think something that too few people are educated about. Number three.
A lot of people have opinions about it.
Oh, everybody has opinions.
I talk a lot with people that I know for sure they don't know what they're saying, and they're trying to explain something to me that I know is not understood.
That's its own kind of horror, not necessarily Gothic, a lot more common. Number three, domestic abuse, even this loving version of it, caused by domestic inequality, is still also a problem. These problems aren't going away, right? They're just buried or tracked or modified. They might get better, but it's still a problem.
Well, John thwarts such just absolutely innocent requests of, how about the bedroom downstairs rather than this nursery? How about going to visit whatever they were, cousins or whatever? No, this will make you too emotional. You know, and it's just simple requests that are not even considered.
It's a problem of authority, right? And her acceding to any of her requests would undermine his authority. And especially if he's anxious about her, which you'd assume that he is, if he cares about her, right? The most he can do is really have faith in his own authority and hope that she believes in his authority and that she'll get better by following what he says. And again, Gilman indicates that if she wouldn't have written, she might not have gone as crazy. Like
Sorry, if she wouldn't have.
if she wouldn't have written, if she wouldn't have defied his orders and started writing, I mean, that does feed her obsession. It does lead to her going crazy in the end. You know, it's not that John's wrong. It's not that he's right in any way, right? But it's not that he's wrong. It's not that the narrator's wrong. The wrongness is the authority that's located in a marriage. And it's something that everybody in a marriage or in any marriage participates in causing, right? It's not just John enforcing it, it's also the wife allowing it. It's their inability to talk or communicate helpfully with each other, to listen to each other. And it's not just John's inability to listen to his wife, it's also the wife's inability to listen to John, right? It goes both ways. The narrator's grammatical formulations show readers how her perspective wasn't just forced on her, it's something that she willingly embraced, right? Even as she thought of her own thinking in her own writing, that's what makes it so horrifying in some ways, is she thought that that's what one expects, right? And even though Gilman does some interesting things with it, you still get the sense that that's really just a belief that she inhabited and took seriously and believed in for herself. Our culture's gotten somewhat better at acknowledging that women have thoughts that deserve to be shared, but not that much better. We haven't made that much progress. We have a lot better lip service and better rhetoric around it, but the actuality of day-to-day life, not that much different. In public, in office, in the world.
But in certain parts of the world, that's changing. You know, you see women presidents, although, you know, yeah, and you whether you like it or not, you know, you had in England, you had Margaret Thatcher.
Mm-hmm.
There's several, you know, presidents in South America. Some of those you may not like the president of Argentina. But they're, you know, women are being listed a lot more, at least politically, in certain parts of the world.
And again, I guess my only answer to that is that, say Hillary Rodham Clinton gets elected president, what we're electing is less Hillary Rodham Clinton than the money that supports her. You know, we're supporting a certain kind of bot-financed campaign strategy.
That would be true in the United States.
Yeah, and again, I'm not sure if that's true universally.
I don't think it's true universally. Okay. But on the other hand, you would never hear of a Muslim woman being president of the country. So.
No, not for a long time. Finally, bad interpretation. We need to learn that the art of being open, or we need to learn to inhabit the art of being open to alternative perspectives. Although neither John nor his wife had a good perspective on the situation, again, if they'd been able to dialogue about it or communicate, it might have helped. Our stubborn refusal to abandon our own sense of certainty all too often hinders us from a healthy and fulfilling life. And it's also what causes a lot of devastation in the lives of those that we love most. It's a happy note to end the class on. Any other questions? Yeah, go ahead.
So it seems like you're blaming the narrator a little bit more. Could you contrast that with the way you feel about Bartleby? It seemed like, you know, they're kind of in a similar situation. You know, and I just wondered if it's a whole part of the culture that, you know, this. I guess I'm wondering how she could have been any stronger given the culture that she was, you know, introduced into, similarly to, you know, the hopelessness of Bartleby, or if you see them as distinct.
So here's the distinction I would see. I mean, the wife does resist her husband's authority. She keeps writing, right? I mean, she does not obey her husband. She only gives the appearance of obeying, and her defiance in some ways floats over a lower level of acceptance, right? I mean, she defies her husband, but at their core, she believes that her husband's probably right. You know, like you get that kind of sense of things, and so it's a form of passivity. And I think what you're sensing is that both Melville and Gilman are using passivity to show the damaging logic of control once there's no reaction against it. Right? I think that's something that the two stories definitely have in common. And what Bartleby and this narrator have in common is that that sense of passivity and acceptance. And it's a strategy in both cases that leads to the passive person, becoming broken, right? And that brokenness as a result shows that the logic of control leads to brokenness and dehumanization and depersonalization, and it tries to eradicate and eliminate everything human about the person that is supposedly being helped by those kinds of logics of control. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. So his, I prefer not to, is her continuing to write, for example, like.
I would say that it's different because Bartleby's I would prefer not to is a more public, aggressive stance.
Mhm.
Like it's a way of, so what Bartleby does is refuse any attempt to make him engage. And he does it in a very neutral way, but he refuses to engage in the conversation at all, not by directly saying, no, I won't do that, but by having that very soft, I would prefer not to, you can't refute the fact that he would prefer not to.
Mhm.
And you can't make him prefer to or prefer not to directly. There's just nothing that you can do with that. And that's part of what Melville's looking at. Gilman also avoids having a direct contrast with the husband, but she does so by hiding it, right? Bartleby's is a lot more open. The narrator hides it. They both avoid a direct reaction to the larger systems of power. They both inhabit and passively permit those systems of power to define them, right? So that's true in both cases. But Bartleby's public statement of I would prefer not to, I think, is a very different kind of stance than the one the narrator's wife takes.
Mhm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Good questions. I'll go other questions.
Daniel, as you read this, do you think as we first encounter her, that her mental health was already over the precipice? That, did the wallpaper actually become part of the pathology? When she got sick in the lower room, if she'd gone to the room she wanted to go to?
I think it's hard to say. There are definitely indications that the woman has a tendency toward over-imaginating. That's not even a word. I'm so sorry about that. Exaggerating, right? The psychological quality of inanimate objects, right? That's a pre-existing condition. Now, had she gone to the other room, she wouldn't have been able to obsess about that wallpaper. Would that have been healthier? Of course. If she'd been able to get out and do some work, if she'd been able to show her writings to John, right? If she'd been able to be honest or to communicate, would that have been better? Almost certainly, right? If her husband had been more willing to accept that there might be something like a mental health problem, would that have helped? Absolutely, right? So is it the fault of the room? No. Does it exacerbate a pre-existing condition? It does in part, but a lot more of it, I think, has to deal with the dynamics of power than the room itself. Because in some ways, any room she would be in would be subjected to that same kind of hyperactive imagining, in theory, right? But the yellow wallpaper was especially conducive to that. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Just as an aside, one of the things that I know that ICFL and all of its curriculum emphasizes the 2 points of moving to the world in recognition that you don't know everything. And one of them is stage 1 recognition, which means I don't know, and if I think about it a lot, I'll make myself miserable. Getting lost on the highway without a GPS is one of those, or your remote doesn't work, or your computer crashed.
Mm-hmm.
The second one though is really, really large, and it seems like, is that I really don't know, but I'm so stupid I don't know I'm stupid. Every time I listen to presidential debates, I get this. You're so stupid. That almost anybody that's ready to run the country, you don't know. None of us know. It's not that simple. There's lots of angst there. And that if you're determined that you do know, that you're so stupid you don't know you're stupid, but you're dangerous if you're given power. And he probably did care about her. I was kind of like, why in the hell are you out so much and everything? And I was, and I was wondering, did you put her in the one room that would drive her crazy? But in the end, I kind of came around. You were so stupid you didn't know you were stupid. So,
Yeah.
I think I had the same reaction on her request. He would not, it was like he shut him off. He wouldn't even listen to
Well,
him.
what idea could a woman have? I mean, come on, like,
But,
I
you know,
mean-
and this runs so parallel to a personal situation. A friend of mine was a absolutely gifted artist, and her husband couldn't cope with her artistic ability or her drama ability, or theatrical ability. He ended up getting her admitted to an institution. And she got released, and she was sharing with my husband and I very quickly learned I had to be mentally ill to survive in there. And for a year, she played ill, you know, and finally was released and committed suicide. But I've always maintained, had he allowed her some of those things, it would have been a whole different story.
but
It
that
was that
requires giving
authority
up
where he
control,
would,
Yeah.
exactly,
Yeah. not being right, to be willing to understand there are things you can't explain or
And
understand.
the more that she didn't engage, the more paranoid she got.
right.
And the healthier he thought she was. I mean, that's what's crazy, right? She knew how to play healthy and
But,
keep it
and
hidden.
I guess I mean, even on that, I kept thinking, he doesn't want her healthy, he wants her sick.
And she says in the very first paragraph, I think, that, you know, something about him being a physician is keeping her from
Right.
getting well.
Yeah. Was today helpful?
Mhm.
Was it
Very
interesting?
interesting.
All right, well, thank you for coming. Appreciate
Yeah.
you sharing your time here.